He was just another old man in a worn jacket. At least, that's what the TSA agent thought when he grabbed that small wooden case and shook it like a box of spare parts. The medals inside clinked together. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, ribbons faded, from years of memory. But to Agent Dave, they might as well have been bottle caps from a garage sale. The veteran stood there, watching his life's honor scattered across a cold metal table like forgotten change, while 100 travelers looked away because discomfort is easier than dignity. But what none of them knew, what the smirking agent couldn't possibly understand, was that the Secretary of Defense had just walked through those same doors, and he was about to remind everyone in Terminal B that some things are sacred, even at 30,000 feet. If you believe that respect isn't something you earn once and lose at a checkpoint, hit that like button and subscribe, because this isn't just about one man's medals. It's about the moment America remembered what those medals really mean. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects, casting that particular airport pallor that makes everything look tired before 8 a.m. Terminal B at Denver International stretched out in all directions, a cavern of polished floors, rolling, announcements echoing off distant walls, and the endless shuffle of people going somewhere else. The air smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, the kind of place where humanity flows through in waves but never really settles. James Miller shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the persistent ache in his left knee reminding him of a roadside bomb outside Fallujah that had happened in another lifetime. At 68, he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body kept score, even when his mind tried to forget. His grey hair was combed neat under a baseball cap that read Vietnam Veteran in faded gold letters, and his canvas jacket hung loose on shoulders that had once carried a full pack through jungle and desert alike. The security lines snaked ahead, of him like a tired bureaucratic maze. A mother wrestled with a stroller while trying to coral a toddler who'd discovered the joy of airport echoes. A businessman in an expensive suit tapped his foot impatiently, checking his Rolex every 30 seconds, as if time might somehow speed up for him. Behind James, 2 college kids shared earbuds, their music bleeding out in tiny electronic whispers. In James's weathered hands sat a wooden case about the size of a hardcover book. The wood was dark mahogany, polished smooth by decades of careful handling, with brass hinges that had gone green at the edges. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay 3 medals, a bronze star with a small V device that caught the overhead light, a purple heart with a tiny chip in the enamel from when it had fallen during a ceremony 40 years ago, and a handful of campaign ribbons that told the story of a man who'd answered his country's call more than once. James didn't carry the case for show. Hell, most people walking past wouldn't know a bronze star from a Boy Scout badge. But the medals weren't really for other people anyway. They were for Tommy Martinez, who died calling for his mother in a language James didn't speak but understood perfectly. They were for Sergeant First Class Williams, who'd given James his own body armor during an ambush because the kids got more life to live. They were for all the names that never made it onto airport departure boards, but lived forever in the weight of ribbon and bronze. The line crept forward with the enthusiasm of cold molasses. James checked his boarding pass for the 4th time, Gate C7, flight to Phoenix, where his daughter lived with 2 grandkids he didn't see enough. Sarah had invited him for Thanksgiving, and for the first time in 3 years, he'd said yes. Maybe it was time to stop eating turkey sandwiches alone in the apartment that echoed with too much quiet. Ahead, the TSA checkpoint sprawled like a suburban DMV designed by someone who'd never actually traveled. Agents in blue uniforms moved with the practiced indifference of people who'd seen 10,000 shoes and found none of them particularly threatening. X-ray machines hummed and beeped, Conveyor belts carried the intimate possessions of strangers, and somewhere a radio crackled with the kind of official jargon that made simple things sound complicated. Agent Dave Morrison stood at Station 3, a man in his early 30s whose uniform fit a little too tight around the middle, and whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else doing anything else. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescence, and his eyes held that particular glaze that comes from 8 hours of asking the same questions to people who'd rather not be there either. He'd been working TSA for 6 years, ever since the warehouse job dried up, and he'd developed the kind of casual authority that sometimes confused procedure with purpose. When James finally reached the checkpoint, he placed his small duffel bag on the conveyor belt with the same care he'd once used to set down his rifle after a long patrol. His movements were deliberate, respectful, old habits from a time when showing proper respect for equipment meant the difference between life and death. "Morning," James said, offering the kind of nod he'd give to any sentry or checkpoint guard. Dave barely looked up from the screen. "Anything liquid, sharp, or dangerous in the bag?" "No, sir," James replied. "Just some clothes and this." He held up the wooden case. "My service medals." Dave's eyes flicked to the case, then back to his screen, where James's duffel bag sat like a grey shadow, full of unremarkable shapes. "Put it in a bin," he said, already reaching for the plastic grey container that had held 1,000 other personal effects. James hesitated for just a moment, not out of defiance, but out of the kind of care you show for things that can't be replaced. He placed the case gently in the bin, watching as it rolled toward the X-ray machine, like a piece of his soul being fed into bureaucratic machinery. The machine hummed and beeped. Dave's eyes narrowed at something on his screen, the dense shadows of metal that registered as potential threats in a world where even nail clippers required inspection. He reached over and stopped the conveyor belt with a practiced slap of his palm. "What exactly is in that box?" Dave asked, his tone shifting from bored to suspicious. "I told you," James said quietly. "My medals, from Vietnam and later deployments." Dave snorted, a sound that was half laugh, half dismissal. "Right, medals." He pulled the case from the bin and turned it over in his hands like he was examining a piece of evidence. "We'll see about that." And then, with the casual disregard of a man who'd never learned the difference between suspicious and sacred, Dave flipped the latch and opened the case. The medals caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in tiny sparkles of bronze and silver. The Purple Heart sat in its little velvet depression, the profile of George Washington gazing out with quiet dignity. The Bronze Star rested beside it, its blue and red ribbon faded, but the metal still carrying the weight of the moment it was earned. The campaign ribbons lay in neat rows, each one a chapter in a story that had cost more than Dave would ever understand. But all Dave saw was metal. Just metal that might be hiding something, might be fake, might be anything other than what an old man claimed it to be. "These look pretty old," Dave said, his voice carrying that particular bureaucratic skepticism that treats everything as potentially fraudulent. "You got documentation for these?" James felt something cold settle in his stomach. Documentation. "Proof you earned them. Certificate, orders, something official. Anyone can buy these things online these days." The words hit James like a slap across the face. Anyone can buy these things online. As if the scar on his left shoulder from shrapnel was something he'd ordered from eBay. As if the nightmares that still woke him up some nights were Amazon Prime eligible. "I earned every one of those," James said, his voice still steady, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Dave shrugged, already bored with the conversation. Sure. Look, I can't let suspicious items through without proper verification." He started to lift the medals out of their case, his fingers handling them like spare parts from a junkyard. "Sir, please be careful with those," James said, stepping forward slightly. "Step back," Dave snapped, his voice loud enough to turn heads in the security line. "Do not approach the checkpoint while I'm conducting an inspection." And then it happened. The moment that would ripple through the terminal like a stone thrown into still water. Dave, juggling the case and the medals and his radio and his authority all at once, lost his grip. The bronze star slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, spinning once before settling beside a discarded gum wrapper. James moved without thinking, the way a man moves when something precious falls. But Dave's hand shot out like a traffic cop stopping a car. "I said step back, do not touch that medal." The terminal seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children paused their restless fidgeting. Even the constant airport announcements seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was listening to what came next. James stood frozen, his hand half extended toward the bronze star that lay on the scuffed linoleum like a piece of his soul fallen from grace. His jaw worked once, twice, but no words came. Behind him, the line of travelers shifted uncomfortably, caught between the human desire to help and the modern instinct to mind their own business. A businessman coughed into his hand. A teenager looked up from her phone, her face scrunched in confusion. The mother with the stroller stared for a moment, then quickly looked away, pulling her child closer as if dignity might be contagious. Dave bent down to retrieve the medal, but his movements were rough, careless. He picked it up like he was collecting trash, then set it on the metal inspection table with a sound that rang through the checkpoint like a gunshot. "Look," Dave said, his voice carrying that particular combination of irritation and authority that comes with a uniform and a bad day. "I'm going to have to call my supervisor. These items need to be verified before—" "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind the growing crowd of onlookers, cutting through the low murmur of uncomfortable conversations like a blade through silk. It was calm, measured, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its volume to be heard. Everyone turned. Walking through the parting crowd came a man in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal grey suit that fit like it had been tailored specifically for his shoulders. He was tall without being imposing, with silver threading through, dark hair and eyes the color of winter steel. He moved with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room he entered, but he carried that authority lightly, like a man who'd learned the difference between power and leadership. Behind him, two people in dark suits followed at a respectful distance, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd with the practiced alertness of professional guardians. One spoke quietly into a lapel microphone, his words too low to hear, but his urgency clear in the set of his shoulders. Dave looked up from the inspection table, his expression shifting from bureaucratic authority to uncertainty. Something about the approaching figure made him straighten unconsciously, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Sir, this is a security checkpoint," Dave said, his voice still carrying traces of his earlier confidence. "I'm going to have to ask you to—" "I'm Secretary of Defense Robert Daniels," the man said simply, reaching into his jacket with slow, deliberate movements to retrieve a leather credential case. "And I'm asking you again, is there a problem here?" The words hit the checkpoint like a small explosion. Dave's face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "Secretary, we were just—" Dave's eyes darted from the credential case to James, to the medals scattered on the inspection table, like evidence of a crime he was only now realizing he'd committed. Secretary Daniels looked at the table, his gaze taking in the bronze star with its small chip, the Purple Heart with its faded ribbon, the campaign medals that told the story of a man who'd served longer and in more places than most people could imagine. Then he looked at James, and something passed between them, the kind of recognition that transcends rank and politics and bureaucracy, the silent acknowledgement of men who'd both seen what war actually costs. Staff Sergeant Miller, Daniels said, reading the name from James's dog tags with the ease of a man who'd memorized more military records than he cared to count. 3rd Marine Division, Vietnam. Purple Heart for wounds received during the Tet Offensive. Bronze Star with V device for actions during Operation Dewey Canyon. James straightened slightly, old habits asserting themselves. Yes, sir. Daniels's voice grew quieter, but somehow it carried further. You pulled 2 wounded Marines out of a killing zone under heavy fire, carried them 3 clicks through jungle to an LZ that may or may not have been secure. The citation says you did it without regard for your own safety, but that's not quite right, is it? You did it knowing exactly how dangerous it was, and you did it anyway. James swallowed hard. They were my Marines, sir. Yes, they were. Daniels turned to Dave, and the temperature in the checkpoint seemed to drop 10 degrees. Agent Morrison, isn't it? He'd read the name tag, but somehow made it sound like he'd known Dave's name all along. Tell me, what exactly is the problem with Staff Sergeant Miller's medals? Dave's mouth worked like a fish out of water. Sir, the regulations state that we need to verify. I mean, there's procedures for what? Daniels asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge that could cut glass. For treating a decorated veteran like a criminal? For handling sacred objects like garage sale trinkets? For making a man who bled for this country prove he's worthy of respect? The checkpoint had gone completely silent now. Even the X-ray machines seemed to have stopped humming. The crowd of travelers pressed closer, phones appearing in hands, recording the moment when accountability came walking through an airport terminal. Daniels reached down and carefully picked up the bronze star, holding it in his palm like it was made of something precious, which James thought it was. This medal, Daniels said, his voice carrying to every corner of the checkpoint, represents more courage than most of us will ever be asked to show. It was earned in blood and mud and fear by a man who chose to act when others might have frozen. And you, he looked at Dave, you dropped it on the floor like it was a piece of trash. Dave opened his mouth, but Daniels continued before he could speak. Agent Morrison, in your 6 years with the Transportation Security Administration, how many Bronze Stars have you earned? How many Purple Hearts? How many times have you carried wounded men through enemy fire? Dave's face had gone from pale to red to something approaching green. Sir, I'm not military. No, Daniels said quietly. You're not. But you are a federal employee sworn to serve and protect the traveling public. And part of that service, the most important part, is recognizing when you're in the presence of someone who has already given more than you will ever be asked to give. Daniels carefully placed the bronze star back in its velvet depression, then picked up the Purple Heart and held it to the light. The metal was worn smooth at the edges from decades of careful handling, and the tiny chip in the enamel caught the fluorescent glow like a small scar. This Purple Heart, Daniels said, was earned when an enemy mortar round exploded 6 feet from Staff Sergeant Miller's position. The shrapnel that earned him this medal also killed his radio operator and wounded 2 other Marines. Instead of seeking medical attention for his own wounds, Miller spent the next 4 hours coordinating medical evacuation for his men. James felt his throat tighten. He'd never told that story to anyone except the psychiatrist at the VA, and even then, he'd left out the part about how young Rodriguez had called for his mother in the moments before he died, how his blood had soaked into the Vietnamese soil that they'd been fighting over for reasons that seemed less clear with every passing year, Daniels continued, his voice growing stronger. These medals aren't just metal and ribbon, Agent Morrison. They're memory. They're sacrifice. They're the physical representation of moments when ordinary men chose to be extraordinary, not because they wanted to be heroes, but because their brothers needed them to be. He carefully placed the Purple Heart back in its case, then turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd briefed Congress and comforted Gold Star families. You're witnessing something that happens far too often in this country. A veteran, a man who served with honor and distinction, being treated as if his service was somehow suspect, somehow less than real. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, recording every word. James could see faces in the crowd, some confused, some angry, some moved to tears by words they'd never heard spoken with such conviction in such a public place. "We live in a country," Daniels continued, "where we thank veterans for their service. On Memorial Day and Veterans Day, where we stand for the national anthem and put yellow ribbon magnets on our cars. But when those same veterans try to travel with the symbols of their service, when they try to carry with them the physical reminders of their sacrifice, we treat them like criminals." Dave stood frozen, his face a mask of humiliation and dawning understanding. Around him, other TSA agents had gathered, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to anger to something that might have been shame. Daniels picked up the entire case, holding it reverently in both hands. These medals belonged to a man who answered his country's call when he was 19 years old, who spent his 20th birthday in a jungle hellhole most of you couldn't find on a map, who came home to a country that spit on him and called him a baby killer, but who never once complained about the treatment he received. James felt tears starting to build behind his eyes, but he blinked them back. Not here. Not now. He'd cried enough for one lifetime. "Agent Morrison," Daniel said, turning back to Dave with the case held out before him, "I want you to take these medals, hold them, feel their weight." Dave's hand shook as he accepted the case, holding it like it might explode in his fingers. "Now," Daniel said, "I want you to apologize to Staff Sergeant Miller, not because I'm the Secretary of Defense and I'm ordering you to, but because it's the right thing to do. Because a man who carried his brothers out of hell deserves better than to have his medals scattered on an airport floor." Dave looked from the case to James to Daniels, his face working through emotions he probably didn't have names for. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Staff Sergeant Miller," he said, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I didn't know." James looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant agent who'd dismissed his service 20 minutes earlier, but a young man who'd been taught procedures without being taught respect, regulations without being taught recognition. "It's all right, son," James said quietly. "Now you do know." Daniels nodded approvingly, then addressed the crowd one final time. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the terminal. "Every medal tells a story. Every ribbon represents a moment when someone chose duty over safety, service over self. And every veteran, every single one, deserves to be treated with the respect their service has earned." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Agent Morrison, you're going to return these medals to Staff Sergeant Miller with the respect they deserve. You're going to ensure he makes his flight on time, and you're going to remember this moment the next time you encounter a veteran traveling with the symbols of their service." Dave nodded quickly, his hands still trembling as he carefully lifted each medal from the case and placed it back with the reverence of a man handling holy relics. The bronze star went back to its depression in the velvet. The Purple Heart settled. Beside it, the campaign ribbons were arranged in neat rows, each one finding its proper place. When the case was complete, Dave offered it to James with both hands, the way one might present a flag to a widow. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant," Dave said, and this time his voice carried genuine respect, genuine understanding of what those words actually meant. James accepted the case, feeling its familiar weight settle into his hands like a long-absent friend returning home. He looked at Dave, at Daniels, at the crowd of travelers who'd witnessed something they'd probably never see again. "Thank you," he said simply, because sometimes the simplest words carry the most weight. As James walked through the checkpoint, his case secure in his hands, something extraordinary happened. One person started clapping, then another. Then the applause spread through the terminal like wildfire, travelers and TSA agents alike joining in a spontaneous expression of respect that echoed off the walls and ceiling. James didn't look back. He didn't wave or acknowledge the applause. He simply walked through the terminal with the bearing of a man who'd finally, after all these years, been seen for who he really was. Behind him, Secretary Daniels watched him go, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. One of his aides approached, leaning in to whisper about schedules and meetings and the 100 other obligations that filled a secretary's day. "Sir," the aide said quietly, "we really need to go. The Joint Chiefs are waiting." Daniels nodded, but he didn't move immediately. He watched until James disappeared around a corner, heading toward Gate C7 and a Thanksgiving dinner with grandchildren, who would probably never fully understand what their grandfather had done for his country, but who would love him anyway. "Sometimes," Daniel said to his aide, "the most important meetings happen in places you never expect them." As they walked away, Dave Morrison stood at his checkpoint, staring at the spot where James had passed through. In his 6 years with TSA, he'd processed thousands of passengers, confiscated thousands of potentially dangerous items, followed thousands of procedures designed to keep travelers safe. But he'd never learned to recognize a hero. Now he had, and he'd never forget. The story didn't end at the checkpoint. By evening, videos of the encounter had spread across social media platforms like wildfire. "Respect our veterans" trended nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing veterans who shared their own experiences of being questioned, doubted or disrespected while traveling with their medals and military decorations. TSA headquarters issued a statement the next day, announcing new training protocols for agents on how to properly handle military decorations and how to recognize and respect veterans traveling with their service medals. The statement specifically mentioned that all agents would receive education about the significance of military awards and the proper procedures for inspecting them when necessary. But the real change happened in smaller ways, in individual moments. When agents remembered the lesson they'd learned from watching a Secretary of Defense remind them what service actually means. In checkpoint lines across the country, veterans began to notice a difference, not just in how their medals were handled, but in how they were seen, recognized, and respected for the sacrifices they'd made. James made his flight to Phoenix. He spent Thanksgiving with his daughter, Sarah, and his 2 grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather's service that he'd never shared before. He showed them his medals, explaining what each one meant, what each one cost, and why they were worth more than the metal they were made from. And for the first time in years, when someone thanked him for his service, James didn't just nod politely and change the subject. He looked them in the eye and said, "It was my honor to serve." Because sometimes it takes a public moment of recognition to remind us of truths we've carried in private for too long. Sometimes it takes someone with the courage to speak up, to change the way an entire nation treats its heroes. And sometimes, in an airport security checkpoint where dignity goes to die, respect can be resurrected by a single act of leadership that reminds us all what it truly means to serve. The medals still sit in their case in James Miller's apartment in Denver, but now they rest on a shelf where his grandchildren can see them when they visit, where visitors can understand the weight of the ribbons and bronze, where the memory of that day in Terminal B serves as a reminder that some honors are worth fighting for, even in the most unexpected places, because heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear faded baseball caps and carry wooden cases filled with memories too sacred to be scattered on airport floors. And sometimes, when the world forgets what those memories mean, it takes a Secretary of Defense and a moment of public reckoning to remind us all that some things, some people deserve our respect simply because they answered when their country called. That's the kind of story that doesn't end with the credits. It continues every time someone chooses to see a veteran for who they really are, instead of who they appear to be at first glance. Sometimes a single moment of respect can change everything, and sometimes that moment happens exactly when we need it most. If this story reminded you that every veteran has earned their place in our nation's history, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Share your own story of service, or tell us about a veteran who changed your life. And if you believe every hero deserves recognition, not just on holidays, but every single day, make sure to hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to Legacy Valor. Because every story of service deserves to be told. Every act of courage deserves to be remembered. And every veteran deserves to be seen for the hero they truly are. We'll see you next time when we uncover another hidden legacy that shaped the world we live in today.